Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. I'm Callum Price, Director of Communications at the IEA, and today I'm joined by Peter Ainsworth, who is the author of our newest publication, Shares in Students. Peter, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Callum. Nice to meet you.
Could you start by describing your paper? It approaches university reform, university funding, and the issues therein with some really interesting policy proposals. But could you start by, in the paper you say that higher education is sort of facing a bit of a crisis. Could you flesh that out for us? Explain to us what is going on in higher education at the moment and what problems need to be fixed?
Of course. I would say it's a bit more than a bit of a crisis. I would say it's a very serious crisis. Arguably, we're witnessing the gradual destruction of a sector which is a major economic and cultural asset for this country. And there are three dimensions to that crisis. The first one, which has been in the news most recently, is the financial difficulties that the universities find themselves in. So the IFS just recently said it estimates that next year, nearly 3/4, 3 out of 4 universities could be losing money. And out of that, this year already, a lot of them are losing money, and some are facing bankruptcy, which of course would be a very tragic end to the tale. So that's been more in the news, but I'm more concerned about the impact on students, not so much of this financial crisis today, but what's been happening over the last 10 to 15 years. And there's a figure which the Department of Education calculates known as the graduate premium. And this is the difference between what the average non-graduate earns and what the average graduate earns. And that essentially has been declining for nearly 15 years now, slowly. And then the most recent measured year, which is between 1922 and 1923, it fell sharply from £8,000 down to just £6,500. That's a reasonable figure to begin with. I'd rather have £6,500 per annum more than not. But against that, you'll have about £2,000 in tax and national insurance, so the net gain is only of the order of £4,500. And of course, the average student leaves university with debts of around £43,000. And in addition to that, to go to university, they've given up 3 years when they could have been working. They could have retained £60,000, made £60,000 or more from that. So altogether, the average student starts off with £100,000 behind the average non-student and is only gaining £4,500 relatively. So that's 25 years to just get in the same position as they would be as a non-graduate. And within that, there's obviously a distribution. Some graduates do really well, some do really badly. And people who go to Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, for example, they will be at the top end of that distribution. They're doing fine. But the consequence of some doing so well means that for everybody else, the chances of getting a good return on their education are much lower. And that's the great tragedy, because I believe passionately that higher education is a good thing, but the way it's being delivered at the moment is not adding value to most students and leaving them with a severe debt around their necks. And then finally, there's a big consequence for taxpayers. Because the students are not earning that much, they're not going to repay those debts, and the taxpayers will be on the hook for that. That could be of the order of £10 billion per annum.
So it's a trident of crises.
Absolutely,
really.
All around.
Yeah. So what do you in the paper put down some creative, quite radical, very interesting proposals? Could you walk us through the central one, which is, in a word, to incentivise education rather than student recruitment, right?
Absolutely. It's very important to look at how somebody is paid, to think about what the incentive is, because all of us, whether we're individuals or institution, we need an income to pay the bills. And so for universities, the odd thing about the way the government has structured the arrangement is the university is paid when they recruit the student, or at least when that student enrolls. So you go through a process of recruitment, and then when the student turns up, that is when the university gets paid.
By the state. By
the state as well. And what happens to the student afterwards in terms of their employment outcomes, it doesn't actually affect the income of the university. I think it's a bit like going and having a haircut. And when you sit down in the chair, a civil servant comes through the door and pays the hairdresser for the cut, even though you haven't had it at that point. And then the hairdresser thinks, well, I can't be bothered, I'll just give them a wash over and a dry, not actually cut their hair, and then sends them out the door. And you think, well, I didn't get what I was expecting from that. And then you find the civil servant outside and says, you owe me £20 or whatever, because you have to pay the civil servant, but the hairdresser is out of it. So the hairdresser, once they've got their money, there's no particular incentive to focus on what really matters, which is a good haircut, or in our case, an education that will pay the bills.
And how does the government approach that problem at the moment? Basically through regulation, they basically regulate they tell the hairdresser, you now need to cut this person's hair.
Well, no, they will say, well, the hairdresser must have a qualification, must have some BTEC or something in hairdressing. They'll say the person must sit in a chair of a certain degree of comfort. They must be there for at least 15 minutes. You must use shampoo. And they'll think of what are the things that make up a haircut, a good haircut. But what they can't put in writing, and this is the thing, all regulation needs to be in writing, what they can't put in writing is what's the definition of a good haircut. So you end up with assessing or measuring what we call inputs rather than the actual output that we want. So the input is the chair, it's the shampoo, perhaps the scissors, perhaps a bit about the person. But what you really care about is it a good haircut? And that can't be measured. And so they can't regulate it. So with education, the institution has to be approved. The individuals need to have certain qualifications, and then they measure things such as how many contact hours do you get. The degree itself is accredited. All these things, but none of those actually are what matters. What matters is that you walk out of the door at the end of 3 years, and you're able to get a graduate level job that will pay well, and that isn't evaluated, and certainly doesn't impact the university's income.
So how do you propose to fix that?
But it's quite simple, really. All you need to arrange so that the university is paid in relation to the earnings of the student. So obviously some students just pay themselves for their university education, but the majority of students take out loans from the government. These are known as income contingent loans. That means that the repayments are a function or based on the income that the student has. And so those loans are tying the repayments to the success of the employment, but the money goes back to the government. All we need to do is redirect those payments so they go to the university. So the university is no longer paid on enrolment, but is paid later on when the student has a good job. And that immediately aligns the interests of the institution and the student, because the student typically wants a good job, wants a high income, and now the university has a stake in that. And so the university's focus is going to be not, is the chair comfortable, what's the number of contact hours, but did what we do for them help them to get a better job?
So at the same time as changing the incentive structure, as you say, so that the interests are aligned, you also advocate for removing those regulations on the degree, the education itself, because they don't need to be there, because the incentive structure is there.
Absolutely, you're completely right. The reason regulations exist, not just in education, but in many sectors, is because the government isn't like a normal customer. A normal customer, they evaluate what did they get, and if they didn't get something good, they don't come again. The government isn't the customer. The government is just kind of an arranger, and so the government always, whenever it's paying money out, it uses a regulation to try to ensure that it gets some value for its money. But in relation to education and many other sectors, it is not something that's measurable in the same way. As I said, like their haircut, is it a good haircut? Did I get a good job, not just the day I left, but over the next 20 to 30 years? That can't be evaluated by a regulator. That can be measured through your future earnings. And so yes, because the government is paying up front, they then use a lot of regulation to try to ensure the students get a good get value for money. But as I said, we started this discussion looking at the deterioration in the graduate premium, and patently that isn't working. No economist would actually expect it to work. Regulation always has this issue. With the Soviet Union, they had a disaster in their car industry because they couldn't define a car. A regulator would say, well, it's got to have 4 wheels, a steering wheel, some glass windows, but can it start? Can it go forward? Can it brake? And if the regulator forgets those, the regulator is limited. They're always just think, what do I really need? How am I going to specify this? And they'll never do it as well as the real market. So yes, so once we've got the incentive structure in place, all the regulation in relation to what is taught and to whom is taught can be thrown out the window. And that'll be a big relief to the universities. And also, not only does it mean academics are valued more because we're now trusting them to do the job that they're equipped to do, but also it will save a lot of costs, because in universities you have a whole bureaucracy whose job it is just to comply with the requests of the bureaucrats in Whitehall.
So I can see how these proposals would be good for the student because they have a university that's working for them and they only have to pay back so much depending on if they get the value out of that course. I can see how it works for the taxpayer because it's the universities who are on the hook for the loan rather than the government. Is the appeal to fix this in your sort of tripartite crises? Is the appeal to the universities of these proposals the lack of regulation? How would they go about funding if the taxpayer wasn't stumping up the initial sum of money? Who would be?
Well, what I would do, I'd have a transitional arrangement. So the idea is that ultimately the universities should lend the whole amount of money, the whole cost of a course, to the student themselves, and then their interests are then completely aligned. That would be a big shock to the system if we did it in one go. So what I suggest in the paper is that the present government loan, which will now be 9,535, they've just increased. They increased the tuition fee cap and the loan amount at the same time. So we leave the loan amount at 9,535. So they take on a student, they've got that as guaranteed income because it comes directly from the state. And then universities, I would allow them to have freedom, the same as approved universities. There's two categories of university, approved and approved fee cap. And the approved universities can charge whatever level of fees they like. And so I would give that freedom to the approved fee cap universities so they could charge on top a premium to secure additional income for themselves. But they could only do it to the extent that they made an income contingent loan that they issue available to their students. So it wouldn't have any impact on access. Nobody would have to put any money up front, but they could now pay the difference through a loan issued by the university.
And that would be interesting. So if the fee cap was lifted, because at the moment you have a system, this is a slight side point, but I think it's interesting to explore. At the moment we have a system where when there's a limit set on fees, which sort of creates almost a perverse incentives for all educational institutions to basically max out the fee because it becomes a signalling thing, right? Well, Oxford are charging 9,000 per year. Well, we should charge that, otherwise everyone's going to think that we're much worse off. We're going to get a much worse education here. But if you lift the cap, then the market can therefore decide if there's supply and demand what the value is for students at each university, and there'll presumably be more divergence in fee rate rather than everybody charging $1,000.
Absolutely, and you raise a number of important points there. When the scheme was first introduced in 2012, it was envisaged that lots would be around at the £6,000 level, and then the premium universities would be at £9,000. And a few did try out a lower fee level, and exactly as you indicated, the students took it as an indicator of poor quality. So they then had to raise the fee level. There are a few that offer slightly lower amounts, but generally everybody charges the same amount. And I think that's very inequitable because Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial College and a few other top institutions, their education is amazing. You know, what you get there, access to the top academics, you get very high, you get low student to tutor ratios, you get a lot of contact time, and the idea that you only pay the same to go to Oxford, Cambridge or Imperial or the others that you would pay to one of the lowest tariff universities, I think that's extremely unfair. And so what I would envisage would happen through this scheme would be those top universities immediately would start charging 20, 25, maybe even £30,000. I think
crucially, they would in your system have to close that gap themselves.
They'd have to loan exactly.
So it's not raising a bar for inaccessibility.
Exactly. So let's say they go to 20,000. So they'd have to offer an income contingent loan of the order of 10,000. But then there'd be some other they'd be at one extreme. At the other extreme, there'd be low tariff universities who would think, wow, fantastic. We can stay at 9 where we can survive, particularly with less regulation. And now we can compete, because one of the things that's been happening with the recent decline in the number of international students is the high tariff universities, the Russell Group, have been taking on more students who are doing less well at A-level than they would normally take to fill up the revenue gap that they have through losing international students. And the consequence for the low tariff universities is that the market's gone dry for them. They can't offer anything, because why would you pay 9,000 to go to a low tariff if you're going to pay 9,000 to go to a high tariff? So that price differentiation would be much fairer and would give a broader range of universities the opportunity to thrive in this environment.
So your system to lift the cap, move the rest of the loans, that cap may be reduced to the universities. They had some stake in it, and then to get rid of the regulation because you fixed the incentive structure to ensure that the students are getting a quality education. The academics, who are the experts in their field, can drive that rather than by sort of bureaucrats in Whitehall, if you like. There's historical precedent for this that you touch on in your paper. Could you just walk us through what the sort of historical inspiration for this model is?
Absolutely. The first universities from the medieval period were the apprenticeship guilds. They were called things like the University of Smith, the University of Tailors, and they oversaw the apprenticeship system, where there was a master who was the man who was already in the trade, and he would take on an apprentice, and he would provide sustenance as well as education. And the education was both in the skill and also social education. And the way that the deal worked financially was that initially the master was providing, as I say, sustenance and education, so accommodation, food, and the student, the apprentice obviously wasn't adding a lot of value. So the master was investing in the apprentice, and then later on, because the apprentices had to commit to a 7-year arrangement. So later on, perhaps the first 2 years, the master is heavily investing in the student. Then after that, the apprentice becomes slightly productive, but they have to continue to work for the master. He'd have to pay them, but he'd pay them below market rate, and so effectively he's sharing in their success. And he then, the interests are aligned because he wants them to be competent and good and skilled and socially aware and behave well in society, because that reflects well on him and feeds him an income. So that model existed for the order of 900 years. There's some academic papers out there arguing that that's at the root of the Industrial Revolution, the successful transformation of society through the dissipation of knowledge, and abolished poverty, led to economic leadership in Europe. And then around after the First World War, there was a cultural shift to the idea that the state should be directing the economy. You had the Haldane Report in 1918. That was followed by the foundation of the University Grants Commission in 1919. And from that point, the state gradually was doing more of the funding. And with the funding, as I said, comes the regulation. And 100 years have passed. People have forgotten that there was a much longer history when the interests of the tutor and the tutee were aligned financially. I'm just saying that worked. This clearly doesn't. You should go back to what worked.
And just to round off, your argument is that if we implement these pro-market reforms, whereby students and universities can work together to mutual advantage, if we implemented these reforms, you say that we could make the UK the university of the world. How is that so?
Well, absolutely. As you may know, the UK is generally regarded to be number 2 in the world at the moment. The US is far and away number 1. But the US, obviously, you also know, we know they're going to have a new president very shortly. And Trump has proposed some adjustments to the way the American system works. He, of course, as you may know, did relatively badly among college-educated people, particularly college-educated women. So he doesn't feel he's got any allies in that community. And he's proposing 3 things. One is to create a thing called the American Academy, which would be free online learning. Another would be to sack and hire new people to do the accreditation of the universities, and the third is to tax the endowments of the very wealthy institutions. All of these would be great news for the UK if we followed what I'm proposing, because the American Academy will take out a big chunk of revenue for the American universities. Changing who does the accreditation, it won't have any effect at all. It might do on day one, but what really matters is the incentives. If the incentives on the new people are still the same, and they'll still be regulating in the same tired way of trying to define what a good education is, so that will fail. And then one of the big differences between the UK and the US is that our most prestigious universities like Oxford and Cambridge, they do have endowments, but they pale into insignificance relative to what the likes of what Harvard and Yale have. And so if Trump goes in and starts taxing those endowments, is going to use that money to finance the American university, then they're going to be weakened. So America is not following what I think the appropriate route, because they could do the same. But Trump is proposing to take a series of measures which will harm the American system. If we do this, there'll be more resources flowing into the sector. Incentives are aligned, we'll get better outcomes, and so we have the opportunity to move up the ranks and overtake US and become number one.
Sounds pretty good to me.
Good.
Thank you for joining us today, Peter. Thank you for listening to the IEA podcast. You can get the report Shares and Students on the website from today at iea.org.uk, and we'll be back soon with the next version of the IEA podcast. Thank you.